Hello and welcome back. Today we are going to be doing a book review of War in Ukraine, Making Sense of a Senseless Conflict, which is obviously a book I don't think too much of, based on, as you can tell from the splash, but we'll get into that. For those of you who don't know, I'm on my other channel, Generalist Gaming, planning on doing a charity stream, raising money for Ukraine. I haven't decided what charity yet. If anyone has any suggestions, put them down in the comments below if you have found a charity you rather like. But that is going to be the second anniversary of the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. And so, to that end, I have gotten a few books, or a couple books. I've already read a couple books. Is the other one around here? The other one is around here. And so, we are going to be reviewing the next one next week. And so, I have been reading on the topic, and this one is going to be a little bit more conversational because I don't think very much of this book in particular, but I'm very happy for reading it. And so, perhaps the thing that is maybe the takeaway is I think that it is very useful to read things you think you're going to disagree with, for the reason that being balanced and being exposed to other information is important and useful. And when I've done this in the past, generally I have been very pleased and surprised with the level of nuance that the other side or the other way of looking at things has. That was not my experience here. I initially started reading this book. There aren't too many books on the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and we're going to call it that. Not like some Ukrainian conflict or the special military operation. We're going to call it the invasion. There isn't too many books on that topic that have been published because it's ongoing, and it is fairly recent. And so it's a little bit difficult, and this is one of the books that was available, and so I bought it without finding too much information on it beforehand, and then it immediately became apparent that it is I don't know if I would quite say pro-Russian as much as I don't even want to frame it in this way because I think that it's a little bit missing the mark, but anti-American in that it is primarily putting the blame for the invasion of Ukraine on the United States, or spending 90% of its time in discourse putting the blame at the feet of the United States, and then giving some lip service to blaming Putin/Russia for the invasion of Ukraine. And this is the primary thrust and point that is given in this book. And so in this review, or in this kind of like summary of some of the ideas, we're going to discuss that, but I'm going to voice why I think a lot of the positions are wrong, as well as not everything, but and some information was eye-opening. For the most part, I was also uncomfortable by I tried to check a lot of citations, which is kind of what you do when you're reading something you disagree with, and you're like, okay, is this accurate? And for a lot of the information that I found particularly problematic in that it wasn't correct, they either didn't cite or I had a problem with the citation, but they do have a lot of citations. It's not just pure out of nothing. I think that these people are both Western-oriented. One of the authors wrote a piece on the war in Iraq. The war in Iraq comes up quite a lot. And so, but like the intro from the very start was just very strange. They start talking about climate change and like the U.S. Pushing for a war in Iraq when they should be dealing with climate change. And it was a very strange sort of opener because it is not talking about the war in Ukraine, in my opinion, in a direct way, but is kind of shaking the fist at the military-industrial complex of the U.S., which, to be fair, I think they have a point in that the military-industrial complex of the U.S. has too much power, and that this is a substantive thing to say, but it is perhaps not abundantly relevant when you are going to be starting to talk about Ukraine, although it is somewhat relevant. You know, Lockheed Martin, Boeing, or not Boeing, or maybe Boeing, I forget the names of all of them, but they're going to make a bunch of money, right, when arms are being sent to Ukraine. Stock goes up, they make money, they make weapons. This is useful to them. And so that's kind of how the book opened up, and it kind of really set the tone that this was mainly going to be about the United States, and to the extent the United States can be blamed for Ukraine, they try and do it. And to be fair, not all of their points, in my opinion, are without substance. However, focusing on these points, I think, is potentially problematic. So the book opens up with or the first or second chapter is like 2014, setting the stage for the invasion of Ukraine, which today characterize as there only being one invasion of Ukraine, and that's in 2022. But we'll get to that. So there's the Orange Revolution, in which the ruler of Ukraine, I can't remember which ones are which. A lot of their names start with a Y, but they are overthrown in a revolution, and they in the book blame the United States for supporting the people who overthrew the revolution, and notably also really focus in on a group called Svoboda, or Svoboda. I don't know how to pronounce it because I'm just reading it, and this group was far right, and they characterize as Nazi, and I was not able to double check, but I think that the characterization is probably fair. Or this is what I was able to glean without digging too into it, but if you wanted to check more, you could. But apparently they were a group that was somewhat instrumental in the Orange Revolution, and the book argues that the U.S. Was backing the overthrow of the current government, which in another book I've read, From Cold War to Hot Peace, which was written by the diplomat between the United States and Russia, he is denied, but obviously he has a reason for denying it. And as to whether or not the U.S. was involved in the Orange Revolution, I don't have a really strong opinion, or I feel enough a knowledge base to really make a point or a comment on it. This book asserts that they did. I think that might be true. I think that might not be true. But the second part that they comment on is that they characterize the Russian seizing of Crimea and the land of the Donbass as being part of that revolution, not as being an invasion of Ukraine by Russia in 2014. And I just think that this is patently wrong for a lot of reasons. The perhaps most obvious being in that later years, Putin bragged about taking Ukraine by force. And he is interested in imperialism and, restoring, I think the phrase that gets used is bringing Russia off of its knees is kind of the phrase that gets used in Russia, but like restoring the glory to the old, borders of the Soviet Empire. He in interviews say stuff like Ukraine belongs to Lenin, and Ukraine is like part of Russia, or it like historically was part of Russia, so it should be part of Russia. This is an interesting argument he's been making somewhat recently. A former prime minister of Mongolia somewhat trolled him by just like sending him a map of Mongol Empire at its height and being like, hey, look, it's where we should control, because it's anyways, that's a bit of a tangent. I think in 2014 there's extremely strong evidence that it was an invasion of Ukraine, which he said, like, under the guise of it being a revolution. Russian troops who were employed in the Russian army fought in that revolution, although we'll come back to the quote, air quotes, later. And they overthrew the government, and then there was a referendum, which is not internationally recognized. 94% of Crimeans voted to stay in part of Russia, or to be assimilated into Russia. And this is an important thing. No one recognizes that diplomatically, I think there's like 1 to 3 countries or something. I would have to double check. It's not internationally recognized, that referendum. As far as almost all, the world stage is concerned, or the world's countries, Crimea is a de jure, part of Ukraine, but de facto, in terms of who controls it, is Russia. But what the book and the author characterizes, or the authors rather, to be fair to the two authors, this book was apparently written in a very short time, and it's about a very current affair. So to some degree, you have to cut them some slack. But what their fundamental argument is that this is now a part of Russia. And this context, or this framing, is essential for kind of one of their later arguments, which is that Russia was attacking before it got attacked, because Ukraine was planning to take back Crimea or invade Crimea, rather than kick out the invaders, which I think is the proper characterization. So there was that, and so that's kind of like the settings of the stage chapter. There's a lot more. There's another chapter on the Minsk II agreements, where they kind of go more into saying that this is de facto, part of Russia. It's a part of Russia, this referring to Crimea. And so they deny in the book, they deny that they were invaded in 2014, Ukraine. I think they, to some degree, deny that Russia invaded Georgia. That's like kind of a separate thing, which is a bit of a tangent. But they make the argument that since Ukraine's official policy is that Crimea is part of its sovereign territory, Ukraine is planning on invading, and since the U.S. or NATO, by the way, they use that interchangeably in a way that I think is not correct, which is that they ascribe to NATO whatever the U.S. does, they argue that NATO's doing, which U.S. can do stuff independently of NATO, right? So you have to blame U.S. for what the U.S. does and not blame NATO for what the U.S. does, but that's like a bit of a separate thing. But they argue that since the position of Ukraine is that that is their territory, they're planning to invade, and since they are receiving both arms aid and also that's lethal weapons aid following Trump entering office, because they are receiving that and they are receiving training from NATO, they are just becoming stronger and stronger and stronger relative to Russia. So if Russia's going to have to fight a war with Ukraine, in the future, it's better that they fight it immediately. And so they fight this defensive war, to go about this. They also touch on the denazification sort of argument, which is one that is common, as far as Putin goes, and that is referring to the military group, the far right-leaning military group, who following the overthrow in 2014 of that government, they were a big part of it. They talk about how Zelensky made fun of the far-right people, but then they basically say that he kind of let them into government when he took over the person who, and I can't remember the name, person preceding Zelensky. And that he kowtowed to NATO is kind of the way they characterize it. Okay. And then we get to them talking about the Russian invasion. And almost all throughout, they very, very briefly will have about one paragraph, talking negatively about Putin or decrying what Russia does as criminal. And in that, the language they will use is not particularly inflammatory. They very critically call Putin a criminal, and then they move off to inflammatory language to talk about the United States and NATO. I think that if you are going to blame anyone, I think that the amount of blame you can lay at the U.S.'s feet is probably non-zero. I'm willing to concede this. I think if you're going to blame anyone in the room for the invasion of Ukraine, right, it's going to be Putin. And unambiguously. It's clearly, in my estimation. But notably throughout the book, they don't do very much condemnation or analysis of what's going on in Russia. Or Ukraine, for that matter. A lot of it's, talking about the United States and NATO. They do make an enormous amount of comparisons from the war in Ukraine to the war in Iraq. And this sort of drawing an equivalency is, the classical whataboutism, which is very, very common in the Russian propaganda machine, which is that, whenever they they love to talk about the Native Americans, and by God, they're not wrong. The United States did the Native Americans dirty. I agree. But when you're using it in response to critiques of what you are doing today, when you refer to what someone did in the past, this is a deflection. It doesn't make the deflection false. But what it's an obvious argumentation device that makes it so you don't have to actually talk about what you're doing. You just deflect to what the other person's doing. And to be fair to the authors, one of the authors wrote a book on Iraq, right? And so this is going to be a lot more within their wheelhouse, as it were. But they do talk about the Russian invasion, and they basically say that whatever atrocities that Russia is engaging in, they draw an equivalency between them and what the U.S. has done in the past. And this is the primary thrust, right? It's not aiming to be maximally informative about what Russia's doing. It's just whatever Russia's being criticized for, they just the U.S. has done that. The U.S. has done that. And they're not wrong on some of those fronts. A lot of people died in the Iraq War. A lot of civilians died in the Iraq War. I'm not an expert on the Iraq War. I can't respond to that. I haven't read books on the Iraq War. I've read a few books on Putin and Russia and this type of stuff, but there aren't too many books to read on the Ukrainian war right now. But anyways, they talk about the invasion. And then there's a chapter on NATO. And what they argue in NATO, that chapter, is that, and I won't take too much, they argue that NATO is not really a defensive alliance and that it's engaged in offensive action multiple times. And they also, I think, I'm not sure which chapter it's in, but they also talk about grievances that Russia has with the United States, and will repeatedly come back to the notion that the United States has been provoking Russia, which is a bit strange because they gave like several pages of analyst opinions saying that if the United States does this, it will provoke Russia. And so this is an analyst's opinion, and say if the United States does this, it will provoke Putin. And then if the United States does this, it'll provoke Putin. And if the United States does this, it'll provoke Putin. And that might be true. But in the end, when someone gets provoked into engaging in an action, they are the one who's responsible for that action still. Like, it's not like, if I call you a bad name and you hit me in the face, you're responsible for hitting me in the face, right? And so just because someone thinks that something will elicit a specific response out of someone who's a thug, in which they will behave like a thug, that doesn't mean that they're not behaving like a thug. You know, like, they, like, completely, I don't think they mentioned once that Putin's, like, assassinated a lot of his, like, political enemies or stuff like this. And so, okay. They get into this NATO myth versus reality, and I think it's in this chapter they talk about several grievances internationally with regards to the United States and Russian relations. I know that Russia was a supporter of Assad, and the U.S. worked to overthrow Assad, and I think that that's probably a legitimate reason to be annoyed. Not saying I like Assad, I'm just saying, like, that makes sense. I know that there was, and this book doesn't cover this at all, but during the Arab Springs, I think in Libya, overthrowing, I think, Gaddafi, the United States and Russia worked together. I'm really hoping I'm not messing those names up. But what ended up happening is the United States and Russia agreed on a particular intervention, and then the United States did more than that. And I find that a little bit unsavory as well, because if you're engaging in like some sort of coordinated effort, Russia would have never signed off on the coordinated effort, and they needed it because it was like the UN Security Council or something like this, and so United States agreed to something and then they just like did something else, which is, this book doesn't talk about that at all, but I just wanted to mention. And then also their coordination in the war in Iraq, where Russia actually helped the United States out at the beginning of it, at least. And I think they kind of pulled back, and forget if it was 2004, 2006, or 2007. The book mentions exactly, or a different book of mine mentions kind of when the Russia stopped supporting that thing. But it's important to note that, look, if you're going to criticize the United States for the war in Iraq, Russia was involved in that too at the start. So, like, and Russia, like, they don't mention it all, because the book's fundamentally not about Putin, and it's not about Russia, and it's not about Ukraine. They don't mention at all the way that, like, Russia flattened Chechnya. But, okay. They do talk about NATO. In NATO myth versus reality, and they paint it as being an offensive alliance by, discussing the Assad thing, by discussing the war in Iraq, and discussing what happened in Yugoslavia/Kosovo. We're not going to get too deep into that, but I think that characterizing it as like an offensive alliance is a bit of I don't think that's. I think I would like to. No member of NATO has annexed, as far as I can tell, a neighboring state or neighboring state's territory. This is not what's going on. Russia has annexed Georgian land. Russia has annexed Ukrainian land. And then they put some like sham referendum on where they said the Crimeans voted for it and they say it's legitimate or whatever. And they open up the Ukrainian war in 2020. We're starting to get a little bit past that. And they open it with, was it 2020? It was 2021. And they start it with like recognizing, the other countries that are in the Donbass region, which are no one internationally recognizes except for Russia, right? Where you're just going to say the land of your neighbor is a different country, and then you're going to install your puppets and do this sort of thing. This is fundamentally, you can't point to something and say NATO's put their hand in it. Now, the United States has engaged in regime change, and to be fair, I think that's more the United States than NATO, and I'm not a huge fan of regime changing, like foreign nations, and I'm not trying to argue that I am, but the United States is not the United States too, at least not in a while. NATO is not attacking and annexing neighbors. To my knowledge, the only other time, like in recent history, that comes to mind when I think of someone attacking and with the intent to annex a neighbor is Saddam attacking Kuwait. And so, yeah. They also talk about, there's a chapter on informational warfare, and it argues that the United States is just this massive propagandist machine. And so to some degree, I think that a lot of media companies sell out to corporatism, and I think they also sell out to sensationalism. The notion that they're selling out to some sort of anti-Putin agenda, like wholesale, like all together, is, I think, just incorrect. There are news, anchors and pundits and stuff who are free. They have free speech, and they are critical of the United States, and they sell like the Russia, propaganda lines. And you know what? They haven't been assassinated. They're not falling on any bullets. Because we have free speech in the United States. Russia controls most of the media corporations, almost all of the big ones, basically. The state controls it, or oligarchs directly linked to Russia. One of the very first things Putin did after taking office, which I can't remember the name of the gentleman, but the biggest media corporation, Putin just seized all the assets for. A lot of journalists and oligarchs that were critical of Putin at the start of the invasion of Ukraine managed to find their way out of a window or how to fall on a bullet. Accidents happen. And so it's this notion that the U.S. is on the worst side of this informational warfare, I find very suspicious. I mean, someone can point me out to a journalist that has died suspiciously after voicing that Russia is in the right here, and the United States really provoked this war. And feel free, comment section's open if you want to link any sort of sauce on that. But I don't think it's forthcoming, and so in terms of the information campaigns, I don't think... I kind of laughed when I saw the chapter title. And then they talk about sanctions is another chapter. And this one is... they frame it in terms of the United States, in putting sanctions on Russia, is morally responsible for all the effects of these sanctions. And they first of all make this strange argument to me, which is that Russia's really not that negative affected by the sanctions. And then they go on to talk about how other countries are more negatively affected by the U.S.'s involvement in sanctions and this type of stuff, which I thought was strange. Like, throughout the book, they are blaming the United States for the negative effects of the Ukrainian war, being like, they also like give this vibe as like, if they were willing to, if the United States didn't lean on Ukraine to not negotiate, and Ukraine just negotiated giving up the Donbass and Crimea, of course, they don't articulate it like that. They articulate it like just recognizing the sovereign borders and like of, these countries in like Crimea/Russia. Then everything would be nice, but instead the like homicidal like United States is like, or NATO, more specifically the United States, but they have this type of argument. And finally they argue about how the potential of nuclear war is a reason why the war has to be stopped immediately, and this is just so horrible and this type of thing, and the United States doesn't like to agree to nuclear treaties. The reason that the SMART treaty like didn't get renewed, between strategic, I forget what the SMART acronym stands for, but it's talked about extensively in the book, From Cold War to Hot Peace. And the primary sticking point between the two countries, which made Russia unwilling to accept the treaty, is that Russia didn't want the United States to be developing or deploying any sorts of missile defense mechanisms. This was the sticking point. They were both fine with drawing down the number of warheads, which was the entire intention of the treaty. But Russia did not want defensive mechanisms, and the United States did not agree to this because the United States' defensive mechanisms are better. Tactically, this makes sense. You could perhaps, this is like the way the way the book characterizes it is the U.S. was obstinate and unwilling to give something up, and I think that's a gross oversimplification, and Russia was not willing to let that part of the clause go in the thing that the United States could not have defensive measures, and the United States said no, these are not offensive, and then Russia said they're offensive to us. And so that's why it can never get resolved. But the way the book frames this is that it's all the United States' fault because they weren't willing to accept stuff which led to huge proliferation. They also briefly discussed the agreement which actually rid Ukraine of its nuclear weapons. Ukraine had a huge stockpile of nuclear weapons, and they lost. They agreed to give them up, ironically, in exchange for security guarantee from both Russia and the United States. And Russia's very obviously now violated that security agreement, and they talked briefly about that, but I believe the point that they brought it up was just to shellac the United States, and they completely leave out, in terms of criticism, talking about how Russia violated that agreement, by invading Ukraine twice, or according to the book, once. And so we have I think I've tried to give it a lot of examples without getting too deep into the details. I don't want to read the book aloud and be I disagree with this, and then read it and be I disagree with this. But I think I've kind of painted a picture of what the book's about. But I'm very happy that I got to read through a lot of these talking points, even if I disagree with them, because it makes it's important to understand both sides of things, and very often it is more nuanced. And to be fair, there are some points in here that I think are substantive, and it's just not. But I also think that their omission of a lot of information I thought was a gross oversight as well, because they omitted basically any information wherever they could that would condemn or blame Putin at all. And I think that this is, even if you're trying to be even-handed, you're not going to completely omit information like this. Just if you're talking about U.S. Russia relations, you should bring up what happened in the Arab Spring. You should bring up the disagreements over Assad, the disagreements over the handling of the Iraq War. That's kind of when relations sort of soured. Is Russia wanted to be consulted and more involved in the way that the United States handled the Iraq War, and the United States just didn't go that way, right? And this is kind of some initial cause of breakdown. But I think that the main reason that Ukraine is being invaded is because Putin wants to land, and there was, who's the president of Belarus, or the president of Belarus? Lukashenko. I remember kind of in the earlier stages of the Ukraine war, he leaked a plan to, after taking Ukraine, take Moldova, and all the arguments that are put forth in the book, regarding the provocation of the Ukraine joining NATO, being trained by NATO troops, this type of stuff, the NATO expansion, none of that applies to Moldova. Why are you planning on invading Moldova? And there's another leaked thing about, eventually integrating Belarus. The game plan is restoring Soviet borders. And not some sort of, it's just under the guise of plausible deniability, being oh, we liberated Crimea in the Donbass. Anyways, let's get into the ratings, because we're going to rant about Putin on the stream. This is the plan, and so we'll get to that. But for utility, I give it a 1.5. I consider this not wholesale wrong, but definitely at least the wrong framing. But also, I consider a lot of the information not very useful. I think that framing what happened in 2014 as a revolution when Putin himself has said in interviews that they took back Crimea, or like we conquered Crimea or we annexed Crimea, like these types of things. Calling it a revolution in Crimea that we just like helped out is just wrong. I think a lot of the information is not useful. I think to the degree it is useful, it's useful to hear both sides. I think that this is not... I have not read, at this point yet, an even-handed version, I think, of U.S.-Russia relations. The book I read the book by Gary Kasparov, Winter is Coming, very obviously polemic on Putin. Like, it's a hit piece. It's obviously a hit piece. I think Putin deserves it. He's certainly done enough hits in his life, but I understand what it is. I think that the guy who was the diplomat from the USA to Russia in the book From Cold War to Hot Peace, I think he has an obvious conflict of interest. I think this is incredibly biased. I think this is more biased, but I might be biased in that regard. And I think that the other book I'm reading might end up being biased, but I hope it's even-handed. We'll see. We'll check citations. We'll do our best. Information's hard to evaluate. But I think the information in this is particularly bad. I think Putin's a thug. I think he's to blame. I think the United States is certainly non-zero, but if you ask who's most responsible, I think if your answer is the United States, you're out of your mind. I mean, I don't even think you could make an argument that like it's not necessarily Putin, it's like the cultural milieu or like something like this. But like you can make the argument that the United States didn't help things out. That's fair. That the United States could have prevented the conflict, maybe. But principal cause, no. That's a stretch. I think. And I think that, yeah. Okay, novelty 3.5. I would have scored it higher in novelty because I do think that the strong anti-Putin position is the predominant position in the United States. If you're consuming media and what's happening, this is what you're going to receive. You're not going to receive what are kind of like more the Russian talking points. So I think that it has some novelty in this regard. But I think if you didn't read this, you're A-okay. Which is like kind of the secondary part of the novelty. Novelty really takes two parts, like how hard is it to find or access this information, and then the secondary part being how bad is it if you miss it. If you miss this, that's perhaps preferable, but okay, it certainly is interesting. For entertainment, I gave it a 3.5. Maybe this is a little bit low. I don't know, it's an informational book. Maybe it should have been a 4. It's hard to say. It's not spectacularly entertaining. They certainly weave a little bit of a narrative, but okay, 3.5. Style, I gave it a 4. Something that really annoyed me was just absolute enormous use of like the sarcastic quotation marks or like the disapproving quotation marks. I think that that's just like stylistically bad, and I find it annoying. So we marked them down for style, but the writing is clear and it flows like coherently, and other than that, I mean, like, you can tell that they're very snarky when talking about the U.S. and very clinical when talking about Russia, where they feel like, okay, we can't not say that what Russia did was criminal, so we'll put it in there. But you remember what the United States did to Iraq. That was also problematic. Like, and so, okay. It is what it is. And then for readability, I gave it a 6. I think it's an easy read. Fairly straightforward. And then for interest, I gave it a 4.5. I really didn't know how to give the interest category at all, because I think the topic's like an interesting one, but I think if you're trying to become informed on the topic, this book is terrible, so like I don't know what to say. So an overall score of a 3.83. As far as recommendations go, generally wouldn't recommend this book. I think I would actually just probably... It's not even like... Okay, so I've said it's like Russian propaganda talking points. It's not even like as much pro-Russia or pro-Putin as it is like... it seems to be written by... I mean, I didn't double check the background, but I think that the people are Americans, and it's just like this desire to self-flagellate, and then also just like there was a ton in there about the Iraq War, like in a way that like I think is not appropriate for like trying to write a book on something. Like it's just like it's a red herring. It's not that it's wrong. It's not that like I'm trying to argue that the United States' involvement in the Iraq was just or something like this. I don't know enough about the Iraq War to comment on it, but it's that this is not the Iraq War. This is an invasion of Ukraine, right? And the party that was most analyzed in this book is a party that's not even directly involved. Now, to be clear, this is definitely a proxy war between the United States and Russia. And also, if it goes hot, I think that is spectacularly bad. I agree with that part of the book's evaluation, but I think that this is just... I would not recommend this book to become more informed on either Putin or the Ukrainian war. And I wish I had a better book to recommend specifically, but the Ukrainian lily is still fresh. We're still waiting for people to write about stuff. I think the best you can do is read stuff about Putin or read stuff about U.S.-Russian relations. This has been what I've tried to do. It's, to be fair, the book Winter is Coming is not entirely without bias. This is the book by Garry Kasparov, who actually ran against Putin in an election. Or if I'm the writer of this book, I've written, just getting off of reading this book, I just want to like air quote everything like snarkily, which is what the book does. But you know, Garry Kasparov ran against Putin in the election, right? And so it's not like he's not without bias. And the diplomat between the U.S. and Russia are going to be biased again. But you know, you can look up the events, and a lot of people falling out of windows in a way that does not seem appropriate, at the very least, and also seizing assets of people who are critical. There's a lot we could go into, but this book doesn't discuss Putin, so we'll not unpack it in this review. But I would not recommend this book, just wholesale. Like, if you got anything from this review, if you got to the end of it, and you're like, you're here, first of all, welcome. But second of all, don't buy this book. There's even if you wanted the Russian argument, there's probably a better one. Like there's I forget the name of the philosopher who's like talks about the rise of the Third Empire as like kind of you would be better off reading some of like the underlying philosophy or that like that people attribute the Russian imperialism to. Like there's just like I think even if you, I mean, I guess if you want a book ripping on the United States and trying to blame the United States for Ukraine, this is the book for you. I think that position's wrong, but I guess if you want that, give this a try, I guess. Anyways, hope you enjoyed. Hopefully that wasn't too ranty. I'm a little pressed. This is obviously one I feel strongly about, which is why I'm doing planning on doing a charity stream on the 24th. If you want to come through for that, you can. We also will be, I think, uploading the review for this book, A War Made in Russia, next week, depending on how fast I can read it. But this is an interesting one where it argues less that this is Putin to blame and more, it's not Putin's Russia that's invading Ukraine, it's Russia's Putin that's invading Ukraine. Might be like the most succinct way to put it. Just kind of gotten started in this book, but he argues that it's like the cultural history of Russia that's more attributable to, and that Putin is like an exemplar of a lot of the attitudes, as well as like the feeling of humiliation following, the collapse of the Soviet Union being very real and something that you could, attribute the conflict to. But anyways. I think we already did the outro YouTube stuff, so have a good one.